Well, hey, it's Wes. So, the new a7R Mark III has been announced. Now, everyone's already got their videos, and I'm not in New York, and obviously I don't have one in my hands. All I have is my a7 Mark II, and you're being filmed on the A9. So, what do I have to say about this? Well, a lot of people are talking about how the a7R Mark III makes the A9, you right there, obsolete. They're not seeing a lot of the fine print, if that's what they think. These are two very different cameras for very different purposes, and we're going to go as quickly as possible through the reasons why they are very different. Yes, there are some reasons why they are the same. They both have the new a7Riii battery, which is fantastic, great battery life. If you want to hear any more of my thoughts on the A9 and like the details about that camera, I have a previous video. Maybe I'll throw up a link or a button or something. So they both have that new fantastic battery. They both have 2 card slots, one of which is disappointing. They both have a touchscreen. But that's kind of where the similarities end. So on the a7R Mark III, you're looking at a 399-point autofocus system that covers 68% of the frame. However, on the A9, you have 693 phase detect points that cover 93% of the frame. That's actually a pretty big difference. So if you're going out to the edge of the frame or you want your eye detect autofocus to go wherever you want on that frame, the A9 is still going to give you better performance, and it actually has, according to Sony, just marginally still better autofocus. They want it to be the top still. Buffer size, obviously you have much larger photos coming out of the a7R Mark III. However, that will leave you only with 76 shots in the buffer in RAW, whereas the A9 can give you 240. Now next is the biggest difference between these cameras is the sensor design. Most of you are already familiar with the fantastic sensor that was in the a7R Mark II, and this one is a refresh of that sensor. So you still have the same 42.4 megapixels, and this one is still backside illuminated, but they have added a better pipeline, better image processing, lower noise floor, and some sort of an anti-reflective coating on the micro-lensing on the surface itself, so it's supposed to get you one more stop of dynamic range. Now, the A9's sensor is an entirely different beast. Backside illuminated, but it's a stacked CMOS sensor. That means the processing in the RAM, some of it, is actually a part of that sensor chip, which makes it much faster. So what is the difference that you get with that? Number one, the speed of the electronic shutter. If you're shooting in silent on the a7R Mark III, you have a maximum of 10 frames per second. On the A9, everyone knows, 20 frames per second with appropriate lenses. They have to be new enough, probably G Master lenses, to get that fast. On the a7R Mark III, you do not have the zero blackout electronic shooting like you do on the A9, and the maximum shutter speed of electronic shutter is only 1/8,000th of a second, whereas the A9 can go up to 1/32,000th of a second. The A9 has a much faster read speed across its sensor, which leads me to the point that a lot of people are probably missing, is how well the electronic shutter itself works between these two cameras. On the a7R Mark II, there are some compromises. Shooting in electronic silent mode, you take a bit of hit on ISO, you stand a pretty decent chance of getting some, whether it's banding or image issues with LED lights, fluorescent bulbs, anything that has a refresh rate. Whereas with the A9, the ISO performance is identical between mechanical and electronic shutters, and it's very, very difficult to cause banding from electronic light sources. You can see a little bit on that in a previous video of mine where I try to do that. I am able to produce it, but not easily, except with like the worst possible imaginable light source that you would never shoot under anyway. And also, if you look at the fine print for the a7R Mark III, you'll see, for silent continuous shooting, it says some distortion may occur with fast-moving subjects or if the camera is moved sideways rapidly while shooting. That's not something that's really a footnote in the A9 material. The A9, let's throw that one up there, talks a big game about keeping things all straight with the electronic shooting. So, that sensor on the a7R Mark III is a fantastic sensor, but it was not built from the ground up like the A9 sensor for silent high-speed shooting. So there are some compromises with the electronic shooting mode. ISO range on the A9 goes all the way up to 204,800, whereas the a7R Mark III only goes to 102,400. Who cares? Who shoots that high anyway? And dust and moisture resistance, that's another one. Everyone was hoping that the a7R Mark III would come out with the same weather sealing as the A9, and according to the fine print on Sony's websites and press releases, that is not the case. The a7R Mark III, it does not guarantee dust and moisture resistance, which is a shame. Because this is something that people were going to want to use for landscape photography and just out in all conditions, and that is not something that they can guarantee. Whereas with the A9, not weatherproof, but it is dust and moisture resistant, and they stand behind that just a little bit more. I have shot the A9 in the rain quite a bit. I had 4 weddings this summer that the ceremony itself was outdoors in the rain. Those couples are troopers. I had no issues whatsoever. I was just dripping wet and wiping the water off the camera as I went, because it's like, you don't want to get it in the lens and everything. But it performs fantastically in the rain. Now, where is the a7R Mark III better than the A9? You have a 10 frame per second mechanical shutter, whereas the A9 only goes up to 5 frames per second. A little bit of a shame that they didn't manage to get that shutter into the A9, but I hardly use the mechanical shutter for fast things anyway. If I'm doing fast shooting, my strobes won't keep up to more than 5 frames per second anyway, so that's not a big deal for me. One thing that people don't like to talk about with the A9 is picture clarity. The a7R Mark III, that sensor is an amazing sensor. That is going to give you enormous dynamic range, 15 stops versus 13.3 on the A9, and the color rendition and just the clarity of everything on that. And I'm going to show you some examples of what I'm talking about here. On the A9, that strange sensor it's kind of the first of its kind, it will cause some bizarre artifacts, whether you're in compressed or uncompressed mode. Other people have noted this. And so sometimes in high contrast areas, I've found that, I don't know why, but at the corner of some people's lips, their lips stop being red, which is bizarre. And when you're shooting directly into the sunlight, you'll get very small red banding. All these things are very hard to see, but they show up, and they're not things that you would normally see on the a7R2, a7R3 42.4 megapixel sensor. On the a7R3, you have more video capabilities. You have S-Log and HLG recording. You have none of that in the A9. Now, I do kind of expect that to come to the A9 eventually. Some people say they're saving it for the a7R or a7S series, but I think that it actually has more to do with that new sensor. It doesn't have as much dynamic range, and they're still figuring out exactly how to get what they want out of that sensor because it is so strange and new. Let's talk about the USB connection on these cameras. On the R Mark III, you have the old USB micro as well as a USB-C 3.1. What does that give you? If you're someone who shoots tethered, this is fantastic. USB-C can go up to 10 gigabits per second. That's 1,250 megabytes per second. Whereas the old USB micro was only 480 megabits per second up to 60 megabytes per second. Now, 60 megabytes per second sounds like a lot, but you'll never hit 100% of those ratings. So that is a huge difference in bandwidth. a7R Mark III is rated, or supposedly has 5.5 stops of sensor stabilization, whereas the A9 only has 5. I don't even know if it's 5. I've done a lot of handheld shooting, and 5 sounds a bit ambitious. We'll see if the R Mark III actually comes out to 5.5. But with that more advanced stabilization comes the pixel shift function. So it can take 4 shots, combine them all together, so that there are no subcolor pixels anymore, but every pixel has full color depth, and then you get extra sharp, extra accurate pictures. So as if that sensor wasn't sharp enough already, it gets you that extra step forward. So what does all this mean? Well, the purpose is, for the A9, you're looking at something that is more rugged, that is faster, that is more capable in silent shooting, whereas with the a7R Mark III, you're looking at something with higher image quality, higher megapixels, higher dynamic range. This will give the best image quality that you can get out of a Sony camera. Which one do you need? Well, maybe you can't afford the price of the A9. Maybe the a7R Mark III will do the job for you. For me, I don't want 42 megapixels. I want 24 megapixels because I shoot a lot of pictures, I deliver a lot of pictures, and that would just be too many for me. I'm kind of disappointed that the a7R Mark III doesn't have the ability to produce smaller RAW files like the D850 from Nikon. You can choose to have the full resolution or a couple different smaller sizes. That I would have liked. Maybe they can add that in a firmware update at a later date. Speaking of which, I expect a lot of the functions that are there are very small differences in the functionality of the A7R Mark III. I expect those things to come into the A9 in a firmware update around the launch time of the A7R Mark III. So, which one do you need? Well, that's up to you. Just make sure you have all the information before you get your hands on the camera or before you hand your credit card over for something. Make the decision for yourself. If you have any more questions, any more answers, any comments, just leave them down in the description. So, until next time, go take some photos. Well, that's a shame. Apparently I need to get some stronger tape.